Good morning everyone, and welcome to my garden. This is where I do my best to grow as much food as I possibly can. I am growing in southern Missouri, zone 6B, 7A. Missouri tends to err on the side of 7A for summer and 6B for winter, so that's great. Missouri can never make up its mind. Today is Friday, August 25th. And August is kind of an in-between garden season for me here in southern Missouri. It is way too hot for a lot of summer things like cucumbers, and it is not cold enough nearly to start my fall crops outside. So all of my brassicas and things that I have already started for the fall season are inside in my grow room because, well, for example, it's currently 8:28 in the morning and it's almost 80 degrees outside. It's been mid-90s by 10 a.m. every day for the last week. We are in a little bit of a heat dome, if you didn't know. I like to take these in-between months/seasons to kind of look back on what I have already done in the garden last year and this year. This is my second year gardening, if you didn't know. So I like to take a look at the garden overall and take notes and compare what I did last year to how I'm doing this year, especially when I start to get burnt out. It's so hot outside. I don't want to be out here very long, but I do want to take care of my plants, and it just reminds me that last year at this time I had less than half this amount of plants and I would have killed to have this many, and it just pushes me through. So my little reminiscing session recently has made me think that maybe you guys might make the same mistakes if you didn't know. So I thought that I would take this time to make a video telling you guys what gardening mistakes I made in my first year and how I have remedied those in my second year. So this is mistakes of a first year gardener from a second year gardener. Hopefully this video can help you guys not make all these mistakes because they were quite detrimental. So mistake number one that I made as a first year gardener was not being familiar with my growing zone. I just got done letting you guys know how hot it is. There's a heat dome here. It's just terrible. But last year, I didn't pay attention to any of that. Not one single bit of it. Didn't seem to make a difference to me, even though it should have. Because having a successful outdoor garden is very heavily dependent on what the weather is like. Why would I not have paid attention to that? Such a simple mistake to make, it really doesn't make sense. By growing conditions, I mean sunlight, rainfall, temperature, humidity, where exactly you're growing. There are microclimates, but first off was sunlight. So currently it is 8 a.m. and my garden is still a little bit shaded, got some dappley sunshine here and there, and that's how it is every day. So the first thing that I didn't think too much about was sunlight. I had my garden, can't really tell from here, but I had it more under the trees, like in front of the greenhouse, kind of right there in that grassy section, and there wasn't very much sun there. I have quite a few large trees in my yard that block a lot of sunlight, and I didn't have it timed properly to know where exactly the most sun would be. A lot of summer plants need full sun, and full sun is 6 to 8 hours a day, and I don't get that much, to be honest. I probably get 4 to 5 hours of direct sunlight a day on the biggest part of my garden, and some of that is still shaded. It just depends on where exactly the sun is in the sky versus the trees, and obviously plants use the sun to make their food, so that's a necessity. Second one is location of your garden, and for me personally, the sun chose my location. This is the only spot on my property that gets enough sun and isn't in the way or isn't directly in front of my house that my garden could have gone. So even with the less sunlight than I'd prefer, this is where it has to go. So that's my location. Your location might be based on the way the water flows through your yard. You don't want your garden to flood. It might be based on the proximity to your home, depending on why you're gardening. It might be based on the shade trees, like mine. So there are just plenty of different things that will choose the location of your garden for you. And I did not put it in the right location last year, but this year I have fixed it. Okay, so an overview of mistake number one was I ignored the entirety of my growing conditions. Ignored them and just tried to grow things, and it didn't go well. Some things got too hot, some things got too cold. Your weather and your growing conditions are really something that you need to pay attention to if you're trying to have an outdoor garden with no infrastructure anyway. The second big mistake that I made in the garden last year was planting things too early or too late. And this kind of goes along with your growing conditions that you need to pay attention to. For example, last year I started green beans in 1 inch by 2 inch cells in my kitchen window in February. If you know anything about green beans, you know that they sprout in 2 or 3 days and then become this size in just a couple weeks. It is still frozen at my house in February. January and February are the coldest 2 months that I have to deal with. So the fact that I planted frost tender beans that grow very fast in February, it was just a mistake. They got root bound very quickly. They couldn't hold themselves up in the amount of soil that I gave them because it was so little. They were stunted because I couldn't plant them out outside. It was still frozen. So yeah, everything about planting those beans in February was a mistake. And on the other end of that spectrum, a lot of people grow brassicas in the spring. I can't really do that. Not very well here where I live, because spring starts in kind of like March-ish, but in March-ish it's still randomly gonna snow. It's still randomly gonna freeze because my last frost date isn't until the middle of April. So if my last frost date is in the middle of April, but by the time it's May and June, it's 95 degrees outside, that's just not enough time for me to bring my brassicas to fruiting age before it gets too hot for them and they'll bolt. In fact, that happened to me this year also. I didn't quite learn well enough from this mistake, and I tried to do spring brassicas and they bolted in May. So starting too early, especially in containers or indoors, your plants can become very root bound, they can become nutrient deficient, and then you also don't have very much space inside your house to start things when it's actually time. So I had tomatoes and beans in February taking up all of my indoor space to where I couldn't start any lettuce or kale or chard or spinach inside my house because it was all taken up by the summer plants that shouldn't have been planted yet. Part of that problem can be remedied with succession sowing, meaning you stagger the plantings of your plants so that they all don't come to harvest at once, or they all don't need to go out at once. So if I would have started some beans in February and then another set of beans in March, then the ones from March might have lived until I could have put them outside. Or with the brassicas, if I started a succession of brassicas in November in my house and kept them in large pots, if you have that amount of space, then they probably would have came to fruition in spring like I wanted. I just didn't have the proper timing for that. Ironically, I remedied my planting timing, especially of my beans, but somehow I got way more beans last year than I get this year. But that is probably because it is so hot this summer. Probably roughly 10 degrees hotter per day than it was last summer. Those growing conditions really make a difference. Continuing on with that topic, my next mistake number 3, is I did not succession sow anything. When I planted lettuce, I planted all my lettuce. When I planted tomatoes, I planted all my tomatoes. When I planted kale, I planted all my kale. So on, you get it. And that just doesn't work. It just doesn't work for me, especially because the weather here is just so up and down. It's going to be cold one week and hot the next week and then hot for a whole month. So succession planting will keep you having fruit to harvest the whole time rather than everything fruiting and then dying, or everything being killed by the weather and you not getting any fruit. So for example, I did one very large tomato planting in the end of February, beginning of March of this year. And I planted those out after the frost was gone. And then about a month later, I started taking suckers off of those tomato plants to root them into their own new plants so that when the tomatoes that I already had planted started to get diseased and too hot just from the weather, I would have tomatoes to go into their place. For example, old tomato and new tomato from a sucker. Same with over here. huge old tomato all the way up at the top of the trellis, and right next to it some tiny little baby tomatoes. Those are cherry tomatoes, just so I can hopefully have as many cherry tomatoes as I can before it freezes and they die. So succession sowing can really save you a lot of time and put you through fruit production for a lot longer, making much bigger harvests and yields. I didn't do that last year. Like I said, everything, if I needed to plant something, I planted all that I thought I would need. Every single time. Wasn't good. I've done 3 successions of green beans this year. They're not growing as well as they did last year due to how hot it is, but I've done it in successions how I should have, and I can literally see it back over there. I already ripped one succession out because it died. There's one that just looks spindly-ish and not great, and then the ones that I just showed you that are up to my knee and doing perfect because I planted them less than a month ago. Succession planting also helps you with pest management. So if you have tomatoes outside through the time that the tomato hornworm is just ravaging your plants, but you also have tomatoes inside that aren't being affected by the hornworm, then you can plant those out after the hornworm is gone and still have more tomatoes that aren't damaged. It also gives you the capability to use more of this food fresh rather than having to preserve it. You just continually have a harvest so you can continually eat it. Succession planting also helps you to never have empty bed space. So if I had to rip out a tomato but I didn't ever start another one and it's too late to start one from seed now, then I just don't have anything to go in that bed. That is wasted space that could be producing me food. So not succession planting was mistake number 3 in my first year of gardening. Garden mistake number 4 in year 1 of gardening, which was last year, 2022's garden. I didn't have a predetermined plan for my beds, my trellises, which plants would go where, which containers would go where. I didn't have a plan for any of that. And it's a lot harder to make a plan for that after planting because certain plants are taller than other plants, certain plants need more sun than other plants. So this year, I configured my containers how I wanted them before planting anything and planned out exactly where my trellis would be before planting anything. It would be a lot more difficult to put up such a large trellis as mine, this here. It would be a lot more difficult to put that up after there's already plants that need to be trellised on the trellis, rather than getting it done beforehand and making sure that you have the available space before you plant things in your garden. It also gives you quite a bit of time to figure out what are good companion plants for the plants that you are growing. For example, I grow basil next to my tomatoes because the smell of basil deters quite a few of the pests that ravage tomatoes. So that's just helpful. But then lastly in this preparation category is I use a lot of bagged potting soil. I try my best to make it organic and nice, nutrient-dense potting soil, but I do buy a lot of bagged potting soil, which is 1, expensive, and 2, runs out fairly quickly. So if I didn't have all my containers sitting where I wanted them, and I didn't plan it at all, I might have ran out of soil. I often run out of soil, actually, but it's a lot bigger of a problem if you're about to plant everything for spring, and now you have nothing to plant into. They're going to have to stay in containers longer, which is kind of the planting too early and too late thing again. This container right here, this metal thing, is my newest garden bed. It's not technically a garden bed, but it is for me. And I don't have anything planted in it at all. I barely have soil in it, actually, but I also don't have plans to put anything in it. I haven't even thought about what's going to go in there because I don't have soil in there. Why think about it if it's literally an impossibility for me to put anything in there? I have some ideas of what I would like to grow in there, but none of it's already planted. None of it's a guarantee. So the bottom half of that is filled up with like branches and sticks and leaves and stuff. And then there's only about 4 inches of soil on it right now because I'm gonna have to go buy some more. So the mistake on this one was that last year I didn't plan where my containers were gonna be. I didn't plan where my trellises were gonna be. I didn't have a preconceived notion of the amount of soil I would be able to purchase in order to plant my items, and I had a lot more plants than I did planting space. Okay guys, down here in the plants, because why not? My next gardening mistake, this is mistake number 5 in year number 1 of my gardening, was hardening off and transplant timing. So transplant timing kind of also has to do with planting too early and too late. If I planted too early, then I would have to keep my plants in their small containers, and that would change the timing that I was able to transplant them. But hardening off mostly is what I mean. When you start plants inside, they get used to the controlled environment of inside. There's less wind, there's no pests, there's no bugs, there's no disease, there's the proper temperature all the time, and they get used to that. So before you put them outside, you need to harden them off, which means to slowly acclimate your plants to the conditions outside. So it's tedious, which is why I didn't do it last year, but it did make me kill a lot of my plants. So basically, when your plants are ready to transplant and they've been inside their whole life, you wait until the evening and you put them outside for only a couple hours and then bring them back in. Let them stay inside overnight. The next day, put them out for a few more hours than you did the previous day. And keep doing that until it's up to 12 hours, and then you let them stay overnight. And then maybe do a whole day without planting them out so that you can make sure that they're not getting sunburnt or anything. Yes, plants can get sunburnt. It was a new thing for me too. So just, you can get your plants used to the conditions outside before you permanently put them outside, so that you have the best chance of success when you put them out, so that they don't wilt or get sunburnt or scald or just straight up die. Alright, garden mistake number 6 was labeling. I was terrible at labeling my plants. In fact, so terrible that I don't know which varieties were even my favorite last year, because I didn't end up knowing what they were. I had them in containers inside, like in a 10-20 tray with a bunch of little containers in it. I would label the row of containers rather than each individual container itself. So once I separated the rows from each other and started planting them actually in the garden, I didn't know what was what because each individual container didn't have a label. If you are trying to grow for flavor or productivity, then you really need to pay attention to which varieties you're growing and which ones you are liking and enjoying, so that you know what to continue planting the next time and what works best for you. This year, I have done a lot better with labeling. Still mislabeled a few things. Still don't know what a few things are. But for a very vast majority of it, I do know. And labeling doesn't have to be a literal tag that says what it is. Because some of my labels are these videos. I will go back and watch these videos where I said, this is a Dr. Wyche yellow tomato, and this is a Costoluto Genovese tomato, because at that time the tomatoes are almost all of the plants that I had, and I could just remember, and then I tell the videos, and then I can look back on them to know what they were if need be. Alright, we're getting through these. Garden mistake number 7 was mulch. The mistake was, I didn't use any. I didn't think that it was as detrimental as it would be, especially for me growing in containers. Mulch is so important, you guys. So this mulch that you see here, there, is actually just bedding, like chicken or rabbit or snake, for me, bedding from Tractor Supply. So it's just like aspen wood shavings, naturally and kiln dried. Natural and kiln dried. Mulching helps with water retention, temperature, insulation. It acts as a weed barrier. For me, it is a pest deterrent because these trees come with a lot of squirrels, and squirrels come with little paws that like to dig in my containers, and it happens a lot less now that there's mulch on there. They don't want to dig through it for some reason. Same with slugs. The slugs don't want to slug on it. The cats don't want to dig it in as much. And then the water retention. Last year, my beds got so dry on the top almost every day. And then at some point when they're dry enough, they become hydrophobic, so they don't even soak in the water. So the mulch keeps a good layering and touches the soil the whole time and retains the water inside of that. And then with temperature, if it's cold outside, the mulch will keep your beds warmer. If it's hot outside, the mulch will keep your beds cooler. So mulch is just, it's so good, you guys. Trust me, I swear, if you take anything from this video, mulch your garden beds. I'm serious. It's now 9 o'clock, I don't have much time. We're gonna try to wrap up through these last two, so I'm gonna do the next one from here. Number 8 is water and food. I didn't have a very consistent watering regimen. I didn't know how much water I put in each container each time. These bugs like to pester me. So I didn't have a consistent watering schedule, but half of that was because I didn't have a good proximity to my water source. I didn't have a hose outside last year. I had to tote gallons of water from inside my house out onto my back porch and down around to my garden and then pour it into the beds by hand to water everything. And like I said, my garden was half this size and it took me twice as long to water it every day. So a lot of the times I just wasn't up for it. I just didn't do it. I didn't have time. So I would water it every 3 days or so, and without mulch, no, not a good plan. Don't do that. Don't do what I did. Mulch your garden beds, water your plants. And then food. I literally, not one time did I feed my garden last year. I was like, why did my peppers stop producing? Why are my tomatoes all tiny? Because I didn't feed them. They used all the nutrients from the soil, and I never replenished it with compost or worm castings or fertilizer or anything like that. So how did I even expect them to continue fruiting? Well, I don't know. First year gardening, you know. You can also overwater. I probably overwatered my plants thinking that they didn't have water for 3 days. Now they need a ton of water. No, the soil can only hold a certain amount of water. That's why you need to do it fairly consistently so that it doesn't dry out. Alright, number 9 on the list of mistakes was the weather. I know I already talked about growing conditions, but conditions are kind of consistent, whereas weather is more of the random bits of weather that we get. So Missouri gets really heavy thunderstorms where I live. The wind gets very, very high. And last year I didn't do anything to support my plants through that. So a lot of them got broken, waterlogged. Some seeds that I had sown had gotten displaced because it rained and the raindrops just, hit the soil and moved them around, which would have been fixed by mulch if I had it. But also, you can use the weather to your advantage. So if it's going to rain, I don't water my garden because rainwater is much better for my garden than my city tap water. I don't have a filter, so I'm sure we have hard water, so I'm sure there's lime and calcium that go into the garden beds that I don't mean for it to, but that's what I have to water with. So when the rain comes, I just allow the water-soluble nitrogen in the rain to make the garden happy. Why would you not? It's free water. But I do have to keep a close eye on it because when gardening in containers, the rain doesn't quite cover everything as much as it would just like the ground. Then also storm protection. I had a video previously this year where I used upside down terracotta pots to protect my small seedlings from the storms, from the winds and the rain. And it worked perfectly. It doesn't have to be fancy, is what that video is called. I'll try to link it somewhere. But you can use the weather to your advantage, but at the very least you need to keep an eye on the weather so that it doesn't put you at a disadvantage. Okay, guys. We are now to the last one. Mistake. Well, there are plenty of mistakes that I made. I could have listed probably 20, but I'm only choosing 10 to share with you. And the last one is harvesting. I didn't know when specific fruits were ready to be harvested. I would leave them on the plants for a terribly long time and they would end up rotting on the plants rather than me eating them. And there are a lot of plants that you can harvest early. For example, tomatoes, as soon as they start to change color at all, you can pick them off and they'll ripen inside. Peppers, you can eat green or colored. You can eat them at any time. Cucumbers, even if they're small, it's still going to taste like a cucumber, so it's not the worst thing to harvest early, but it can be fairly detrimental if you harvest too late. Even if your plants don't start to rot, they could start to be soft and they become more susceptible to pest damage or sunspots. And I just wasn't confident enough last year to harvest and know that I was doing it properly. You really need to do research on what kind of plants you're growing and what varieties and when they are best to harvest. For example, broccoli will start to open up, like the little beads will start to get further and further apart, and you want those beads as close together as possible when you harvest it. So even if your head of broccoli is small, it'll taste better than if you waited a few more weeks and it got too warm for it and it's now bitter. So knowing when and how to harvest a multitude of different plants is very, very helpful in the garden. Okay, everyone, that's all I really have for you today. I hope that me telling you what mistakes I made as a first-year gardener and how I fixed them as a second-year gardener really help you guys to not make the same mistakes. Let me know if you like this kind of content and I could do more of it. Like I said, there's probably 20 more mistakes that I made last year, or even just showing you guys how I fixed my mistakes if you don't want a list of what the mistakes are. I really appreciate you guys coming along in my garden with me. I do really love it. This week, I passed 400 subscribers, you guys. 400. That's crazy. I've been on this, I almost said app. I've been on YouTube for about 6 months probably, and I'm not saying that's like the fastest growing YouTube channel you've ever seen, but it's a lot faster than I expected my personal channel to grow. So I really appreciate you guys being here, and I'm doing my best, even if it's out of my way like this morning, to record for you guys and get videos uploaded. So I really appreciate you guys being here, and I'll catch you on the next one.